Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony 135mm F1.8 G Master lens. And I'm actually filming on it at the moment, and so you can get a sense of it in action for video work. So this is the fifth of the G Master lenses that I've had an opportunity to review. And I would say in many ways it is probably the most exceptional, in my opinion, of the G Master lenses. All the G Master lenses that I have reviewed at this point have been very, very good. They're excellent lenses. However, not in every case are they superlative relative to the competition. That's not the case here with the 135mm GM. This is a lens that it is easy to get a little bit hyperbolic about because it really is incredible in every facet. And in many ways, it joins the 24mm f1.4 GM lens as being, I think, the most livable. It feels like the fewest compromises involved. It's not too big, for example, I find the 24 to 70mm to be unnecessarily large. And its autofocus is not like the 85mm f1.4 in that it feels cruder than, say, in the case of the 85mm, the autofocus feels cruder than that of the much cheaper f1.8 version. That's not the case here, and it doesn't feel like you're having to make any kind of real compromises to own this lens outside of the cost, which we'll deal with at the end. And so today we're going to jump in and we're going to give you all the nitty-gritty in terms of the handling, show you lots of photos, break down the image quality and detail, autofocus, handling, all of those things. Now, if you want more of my quicker overview type review and you don't have time for the nitty-gritty, then I would encourage that you watch the standard review and take a look at that. But without further ado, if you want the details, you're at the right place. So let's jump in and let's take a look hands-on at what you're getting here in this package. So we'll take a closer look at the 135mm GM lens. And so here to give you a sense of overall size on the camera, we'll take off the hood for a second. So this is what I would call the large size of medium here in terms of lenses. And so it isn't onerously heavy. It weighs in at 950 grams. And so, I mean, it's a heavy lens. However, it's obviously nowhere near like the class of a 70 to 200, which typically is in the 1400 gram range. And so it's about 50% lighter than those. Our overall length here is 127 millimeters or 5 inches. And so once again, kind of a big test for me is that at least without the lens hood, I can put this lens face down into my typical everyday bag, which is a nice little leather kind of shoulder bag that I would carry. And so the fact that I can put it in like that is a big deal. So for example, the new Tamron 70 to 180mm, it doesn't quite pass that test. It extends just enough to where I can't quite close the flap. So I look at gear as how it's going to work in my day-to-day routine, and I can say of the GM that it just kind of fits right under the wire, and so it works for me in that aspect, making it easier to bring along. Up front, you've got an 82mm front filter thread, which is large, but not uncommon. And that's a little bit bigger than the 77mm filter thread that is on the Zeiss Milvus. Now, the Milvus actually outweighs the GM because of its more dense, it's kind of heavier metals in terms of its construction. Now, I do want to make a quick point that I won't kind of linger on, but just in terms of the overall design aesthetic, you can see that the Zeiss has got kind of just a cleaner and smoother look. I look at the GM lenses as not being beautiful lenses. I look at them as being well made and highly functional. They tend to pack a lot of features into them, which is fantastic, but it does make for a slightly busier kind of look. And one thing I will say that I've always loved about the Milvus is I love how their lens hood design, it's designed to where it looks like it belongs. Whereas with so many other manufacturers, the lens hood looked like it's just something that's tacked on at the end. I mean, it's not a big deal, but just an observation in terms of aesthetics. One thing I will say, a couple of positive things about the lens hood. It's nice and lightweight, but you can tell it's very, very tough, very, very rigid. It has a nice felt-lined interior. I also like this transition zone right here where it's kind of a rubberized surface. It does include a lock. The reason why I'm fond of the rubberized surface is that it means that this is a natural and proper way to set the lens where it's very, very stable, won't easily get knocked over, but you're also not causing any kind of damage there. So I like that. In terms of our weather sealing, there is flooring coating here on the front. There is a gasket. However, as many have noted before, the gaskets on all these GM lenses are really, really tiny, which is just kind of unusual. And, you know, even, for example, with this new Tamron, it's not much better. In fact, it's not really any better at all. They're for some reason on E-mount in general, I tend to find that the gaskets are, if you're coming from DSLRs, they just feel really insignificant by comparison. But I mean, there is a gasket there. In terms of the overall seals, looking at this diagram, I count outside of that gasket 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different seal points, including at switches, at the rings, and at the buttons here, transition points. Now, let's look at all of what's packed onto this lens. So first of all, AMF switch, standard stuff, but always appreciated. A 3-position focus limiter. Fortunately, you know, your mileage may vary. I didn't find that I needed the focus limiter because, as we're going to explore, autofocus is just fantastic with the lens. So I didn't really need it, but I'm glad it's there. Now, there is a switch on all these GM lenses that allows you to either click or declick the aperture. So what is nice about that is that if you're video centric and you want to just flow through apertures smoothly, you can do that. If you're using it for stills and you want, you know, kind of that finite control, the feedback of the detents, then they're at 1/3 stop intervals. Everything is really nice and precise. I really like this approach. It actually has 2 focus hold buttons, and so whether you're shooting in a portrait or horizontal position, portrait or landscape, you have access to a button, and of course you can program that to various functions within the camera body. I feel like they've done a good job in terms of emulating manual focus. There's a nice damping on this lens, and so that is positive. It also works in a linear fashion and with a, you know, pretty nice degree of focus throw, and so good things all around when it comes to that. And so in terms of our general design, it is, you know, highly functional. I think of this as being a working man's lens, a professional lens, you know, not so much a pretty lens like this one. Not to say that that's not a professional lens, it obviously is, but hopefully you take my point. It does come with a nice nylon carry case, which is very nice, so kudos to them on that. Overall, there's a lot that I'm impressed about here. 11 rounded aperture blades. It can focus down to 2.3 feet or 70 centimeters and gives you a very useful 0.25 times magnification there. And so as you can see, we've got a highly functional, versatile lens that is really, in terms of the way it handles in the field, it is a dream for portrait photographers to use. You've just got so much control here on the lens and everything works pretty much perfectly. So as noted previously, while this is a fairly large lens, like I said, on the large side of medium, and it is heavy, it's not overly so. And if you look relative to the competition, it's not overly large and it's not overly heavy. In fact, if you look at, for example, the Sigma 135mm F1.8 art lens in the FE form, which is really the only true competitor on Sony package as an apples to apples, that lens in the Sony form, now most of the time you're going to see it listed at somewhere right around 1100 grams, but really you've got to add on about 130, 140 grams to that because they haven't updated the weight for the FE versions, which by the necessity of transitioning from a DSLR lens to a mirrorless lens, they had to include the adapting of the focus motor. So there's some extra length, some extra internal parts, and so it gets heavier. On average about 130 or 140 grams in my experience. And so it's not only heavier, it's also overall it's larger in FE form. And so, you know, again, relative to the direct competition, the G Master lens is actually lighter by a good margin and a little bit smaller and more compact as well. And so considering that you are getting a higher grade of build, more features, and by the way, the build of this lens, it is built out of a magnesium alloy shell, which is the same thing that's used in cameras. So it's very, very tough and durable. This is an extremely professional grade lens. And so it's got the advantage of the overall build quality compared to the Sigma. And, you know, and it's also more feature rich at the same time. And so I think that when you take into consideration all that you're getting there, it really is it's a well-executed package. Now, in terms of the autofocus, I'm really impressed with what they have done with this. They have incorporated, you know, another designation of different focus motor type, but you've basically got a dual linear motor type focus system, but it's a high torque linear motor. And so what it enables it to do in this positioning with those dual, you know, high torque is that you basically have no compromise. This lens is incredibly fast to focus. It's not like the 85mm at all. It's smooth, it's quiet, and it's extremely fast. And so while the 85mm I felt like got the job done, although not in the smoothest fashion, 135mm does it brilliantly with great speed, and IAF was just exceptionally good. I mean, I took a lot of portraits during the time. I mean, that's really, you know, what you're looking at the lens for above all else. And I don't think that I ever missed with IAF. It was just incredibly precise. And so it's not only very fast and quiet, it's very precise as well. And so, I mean, kudos to them on that. This is the GM lens as far as the, you know, the kind of the typical prime lenses that is usable for sports action if the 135mm focal length, you know, kind of suits your purposes. It's also nice and quiet for video work. And so let's take a look at our focus pulls here. So whereas the 85 GM, you know, sounded a little bit cranky in this situation, the 135 is just smooth. And so it is a useful video lens in that aspect as well, in that you're not going to be picking up focusing sounds, and it makes focus changes nice and smooth as well. So good things on all of that front as well. So of course the headline here is the image quality, and I have long used the 135mm f2 Zeiss Milvus lens, and before that the predecessor, the Apo Sonar. Both of these are basically the same optically. There's some updated coatings, but it is an exceptional lens. It really is, in my opinion, a Zeiss Otis lens in all but name. It may have met its match, however, and so let's jump in and see if there is a new king on the hill when it comes to the 135mm focal length. So we'll start off by taking a look at Vignette and Distortion. So you can see here a mild amount of a pincushion distortion that's taking place. You can see it corrects obviously really nice and clean. Of the two types of distortion, this is obviously the preferred for portrait work because it tends to be flattering rather than bulging features out. It tends to compress them a little bit, maybe slim the face a little. And so anyway, however, it's easy to correct. You can see Vignette is not like incredibly bad in the corners. It's a fairly natural progression. In fact, at least for when I'm shooting portraits, I actually prefer the uncorrected look from the lens. I think that it has a kind of a beautiful look to it. So let's start off by taking a look at our wide open sharpness here, contrast, and so you can see there is an amazing amount of detail that is rendered here at f1.8 in the center of the frame. It is just remarkably sharp. You can look here on the other side. You can see the detail. This is even at a 2:1 pixel level. It's just remarkably good. So down at our mid-frame result, I mean, you can tell when you have a super sharp lens, you actually start to get a little bit of a moire pattern there from on the actual bill, which I only see on when I'm testing the very sharpest of lenses. But you can see corner to corner, very even. We're not really losing anything, and as we head into the far corner, it just looks fabulous, extremely sharp. So to give us some kind of real world perspective on this is even in APS-C mode. So I'm shooting through branches. So first of all, I mean, great job with the autofocus and repeatability. It just nailed it every time here. But you can see here, even in APS-C mode, how incredibly crisp the detail is at f1.8. You know, and then just a beautifully rendered scene at large. Really impressive. If we go to infinity, and this is handheld 42 megapixels from A7R3, you can see as we go across the trees that are our focus that you can see right off into the corner. Just beautiful crispness even at f1.8. Very impressive. Finally, for portrait work f1.8, you can see that, I mean, detail is just beautiful. Very sharp and crisp while retaining, you know, good skin tones at the same time, which we'll explore more in just a moment. So my typical benchmark is the Zeiss Milvus 135mm F2, which is just an amazing, amazing lens. So how does it compare here with the GM? Looking here at the center of the frame, I am going to say that I think the GM at f1.8 is a hair sharper with a hair more contrast than what the Milvus is at f2, which is, I can't believe I'm saying that. Looking here at the mid frame, I definitely think you can see there is additional micro contrast, better contrast overall than what the Milvus has. Looking up here, you can see it here. It just looks much crisper. There's a little bit of softness there by comparison. And looking down into the corner, here in the corner, it's closer, but again, I think the contrast favors the Sony lens, which is remarkable. So while the GM lens does not claim to be an apochromatic design like the Milvus does, still when it comes to their managing of chromatic aberrations, these give a very, very similar type performance here. So you can see, great contrast on both lenses, but I think that, the Sony again is right there. There's maybe the tiniest bit more of fringing on the Sony compared to the Milvus lens, but it isn't hardly any different in the real world. Now, one thing that is worth noting that at close focus distances, the Milvus actually, I would say that the Sony probably breathes a little bit. You can see here that the Milvus has given us a higher level of magnification. They both actually end up having the same maximum magnification of 0.25 times. However, the Sony achieves that at a closer focus distance than what the Milvus does. So with the Sony being so remarkably good wide open, you would think there isn't much more to get. But you can see that here we look now at f2.8 that the contrast is improved more still to where there is it's just even better looking. We'll take a quick look at the $5 bill that shows things off well. Here, the difference is less pronounced. However, you can see that there is still some richer detail that is rendered there. Very, very impressive. So how about the Zeiss versus the Sony? You can see here that at f2.8, there is a little bit more contrast and sharpness in the Sony lens. Both of them, don't get me wrong, they're both remarkably good at this point, but you can see just detail here. Now, if we look down into the corners, I would say here the Zeiss has caught up. It's kind of a flip a coin, which is better, but remarkable performance from both lenses. You can see stopping it on down to f4 gives you just a little bit more contrast. And so, really, really incredible result here. So here, let's take a look at a real world kind of result. This is at f2.8. And so you can see just really, really impressive. Even at a 2-to-1 level, we have got huge amounts of detail here. You can, read what's there in the stained glass of this church. And so anyway, very, very impressive end results. So here's what maximum magnification 0.25 looks like, and even wide open. We've got good amounts of contrast and detail being rendered there. And I would say that our plane of focus is reasonably flat. You can see that it is getting a little softer towards the edges, but not by a large margin, and still is giving very crisp results. And so, again, I'm very, very impressed. So often the trade-off for a very sharp lens is that the bokeh tends to have, higher contrast as well. However, if we look at the bokeh circle here, it looks quite clean. We can see there is some of that traditional deformation. If you start to stop down, however, this is f2.8, you can see that the geometry is straightening out. As we get down to f4, it's very consistent across the frame. You can very slightly see the shape of what I believe is 11 aperture blades here, but still, because there's such a high blade count, very, very circular, and even at f5.6, not looking too bad here. Now, out in the real world, as far as the bokeh goes, number one, wow, very, very impressive. And then as I look at the back of that, I think that looks quite good. Here's another shot. Most of you are familiar. I love taking this kind of shot, particularly in the winter when I have fewer options. But big wow in terms of the acuity and the delineation, the rendering of fine details, all of that stuff. But then the bokeh and the color are beautiful to me. Another example here, that is amazing. But then looking at the background, I think that it looks quite good. For portrait work here, I believe this is also f1.8. You can see that we have got a good looking portrait result here. I had to raise the exposure a bit in here, and so the detail isn't as impressive as what the lens is capable of. That's because there's a couple of stops of extra exposure there. Just got a weird metering because it was bright outside and the bright snow. Here's another example that I thought was just great. I have done a little bit with the tone curve here, and so don't read too much into that here. I had a preset that I added, but again, at f1.8, this is really challenging. Look at all these bare branches that, you know, that could get really kind of confusing and busy, but amazingly crisp detail on the subject. And then both in the fore and the background, I think that the bokeh looks good, and to me the image is really striking. Here's kind of a softer scene, and you can see that, you know, the bokeh here at closer, again, on the skin and the face looks fantastic, but then the bokeh and the melt away to me is very nice and pleasing. This is at f2.8, and so you can see the background looks nice, and if we zoom in there and we look at the eyes, I mean, number one, despite all the framing of the eyes and even hair hanging down, you can see that the autofocus is just grabbed on perfectly. I also love this shot as a monochrome, just looks really, really fantastic. But look at how great the detail is there on the eyes and the eyelashes. So I did want to compare, just for portrait work, the GM with the Milvus lens. And so, number one, I pointed out earlier that the GM breathes a little bit, focus breathes a little bit at you know, close focus distances. At this distance, I would say that you can look and see that our framing is basically identical, and so it's behaving, both lenses are behaving as 135 millimeters. Difference is that the Milvus is an externally focusing lens. I suspect that there's some floating going on. If you don't know about that, no big deal, but floating elements help to, you know, give good performance up close. I think that's probably what's happened here. And so anyway, you can see that, you know, even trying to focus well, the Milvus we know is very close in sharpness to the GM, not quite there, but you can see that even being very careful, I think I pretty much nailed focus, but you can just get a more repeatable, achievable result with the, you know, with the autofocus and the eye detect on the GM lens. And so again, beautiful performance. So finally, let's take a look at flare resistance. Here's at f1.8. This is on the A9, which allows me to get that shutter speed up higher. And then here is f11. And so what you can see is that in this situation, you've got some veiling, some loss of contrast. You've got a little bit of a ghosting pattern down here. Not too disruptive, however, and, you know, not a bad result. Now, where things get a little bit worse is if you put the sun right up in the corner of the frame, as I've done here. Basically, if you're composing at f1.8, say for portrait work, as long as you frame with this ghosting artifact out of the frame, I mean, the veiling look can be an artistic one. Stopping down, however, this is going to get obviously destructive to the image. It's just too much to try to edit out, and there's a good chance that one of these blobs will end up on the face of your subject. And so anyway, you just, I would say it's better at wide open and use, if you want to use that veiling, then go for it. But otherwise, you know, compose with the sun not in the corner of the frame. So I think you can kind of get my tenor as I have gone through that. There is very little outside of a little bit of flare, you know, vulnerabilities, which unfortunately is true of almost every large aperture prime lens that I've used. And so there's nothing exceptionally bad there, nor is there anything particularly exceptionally good there. But beyond that, this lens is pretty close to perfect optically. It is one of the sharpest lenses that I've ever used, and because of its incredibly good autofocus, I think I get more real-world sharpness out of it than what I have with just about any other lens. It just nails focus again and again, and so those amazing optics are allowed to shine in a way that, unfortunately, I can't say has been true always in my, you know, using my Milvus lens, because even though I'm a fairly experienced manual focuser at this point, there are limitations to that. You know, just that subtle amount, it takes more time, so just that subtle amount of movement in your subject or yourself is enough to offset things at times. So overall, I think that you're able to squeeze the very best out of this lens because it's amazing optically and it has amazing autofocus. It is, as I said, it's one of the sharpest, most contrasty lenses I have used. It is exceptional. Basically, it's exceptional at everything save price, where it rings in at about $2,100 in the US market, which is certainly expensive. Again, if you're looking at the performance, price to performance ratio, I think you would have to say that it is it is, while not cheap, it is probably reasonably priced. And you know, if you're just looking at it purely from an optical level, I think it's a more exceptional lens than the 85mm f1.4, which is similarly priced. The greatest challenge for the 135 GM is this, however, and that is the focal length itself. It's kind of a catch-22 in that I find that out of all the various portrait lengths, particularly when you're shooting full-body environmental portraits, I think the 135mm focal length is one of the most exceptional. It just delivers really dramatic images that have beautiful delineation of your subject, gives you that kind of cutout look. But I mean, of course, in this case, you've got, you know, beautiful color and bokeh and all of that as well. But it's not as flexible a focal length. You need a lot of room to work with it, you know, and even set up, for example, framing to shoot this video right here. I've got the camera placed about 40 feet away from me, and so let's see, that's somewhere around 13 meters or so away. And so you need a lot of room to work with it. And so it's more limiting if you're going to shoot inside. Obviously it's not as flexible for shooting weddings with, for example, because there's just times where I've shot wedding with a 135mm focal length before, and I found it constricting. It's just there were moments where I framed tighter than what I wanted because I just didn't have the option to back up further. And so that will be, I think, the one challenge for it. However, if you're developing a kind of a kit where you've got more lenses than the average person, and you're not just trying to cover the basics, and you want what is one of the most exceptional lenses available for Sony, take a long look at the 135mm f1.8 GM. It is a truly, truly special lens, and one that, let's just say, I am very eager to add to my own kit. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, and so you can explore things at your leisure there. There's also linkage to an image gallery if you want to look at photos. Beyond that, there's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And as always, thanks to you that do use my links to help to support the channel. And beyond that, you can follow me on social media, you can become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.